Hello, I'm Robert Holmberg. This is a presentation of Science Outreach Athabasca, and it's on biting flies, vampires of the north. This is part 2 of 4 parts, and this presentation is all about mosquitoes. So in part 1, we covered what are biting flies and why are they important. In part 3, we're going to look at various fly groups other than the mosquitoes. And in part 4, it's about avoiding bites and killing biting flies. Okay, so this is the first group, the mosquitoes, the family Culicidae. And there's good news as well as bad news. The good news is less than half the mosquitoes are after your blood. And that is because only the females bite, and also some mosquitoes do not feed on humans. Also, mosquitoes are not active when it is cold, so this is a blessing of winter. Okay, the bad news. So there's more than 3,500 species of mosquitoes in the world. There's more than 74 species in Canada, and in Alberta, where I live, there's more than 41 species. So lots of different species. And also, more than 80% of the Canadian species bite humans. Not all of them, but more than 80%. Now, some species are most active crepuscularly at dawn and dusk, and some are active at night, they're nocturnal, and others are active during the day, they're diurnal. So at any part of the day or night, as long as it's warm enough, you can be attacked by certain species of mosquitoes. Okay, in Alberta, these are the genera. Aedes is the most common species group with over at least 30 species. 1 Anopheles, 3 Culex, 6 Culicida, 1 Mansonia, and perhaps Wyomia. This is the life cycle. So the adult, they're separate sexes. They mate. The females produce eggs. They are laid on top of the water. The eggs hatch into larval stages, which feed usually on as they filter out material out of the water like bacteria and decomposing plant material. Then they transfer into a pupa, which is still aquatic, and then from the pupal stage, it floats up to the surface and the adults emerge. So here's a raft of Culex eggs. Some species lay individual eggs, some lay them in a raft. And the eggs can remain viable for several years. So if in, say, a particular year, it's fairly wet and they lay their eggs on the edge of the water, but the water dries up before they hatch, they remain viable. And the next year, they may not be flooded and so won't hatch. And this may continue for several years. And then you have a very wet year, and various years get flooded and will hatch, and you have a large population of mosquitoes. So this is mostly larval stages. There's one pupa in the middle. They require oxygen, which they get from a siphon that they put the siphon at the top of the water to get oxygen. If you disturb them, they swim away from the surface and hide further down in the water column. Now, in Anopheles mosquitoes, they tend to be parallel to the surface of the water and get their oxygen more directly. There's a drawing on the top, and then the photograph has the reflection from the surface of an Anopheles larva. So the larval stages, like all insects, they have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and there's various body parts that are useful for taxonomic identification and separating out different species. And this is Wyomia smithii. It is unusual because its larval stages occurs in pitcher plants. And pitcher plants have their modified leaves to catch water, and then they secrete digestive enzymes into that water, and that's how they obtain extra nutrients, because they live in nutrient-poor locations. And these mosquito larvae are unaffected by these digestive enzymes. And we have pitcher plants in Alberta, but so far nobody has found Wyomia smithii living in the pitcher plants. Here's a couple of pupa. You can see they have these trumpets to get water on their head, and you can see the eye formation, and they're forming into the adult stage during the pupal stage, even though they're still very active, but they can flick their abdomens and move up and down the water column. You can see the coiled legs and the wings through the thin cuticle. And as I say, they're actively mobile. Now in Mansonia, it's quite different, and it obtains its air or its oxygen not directly from the air, but indirectly through cavities in plants that have air in them for floating. So the larval stages and the pupal stages penetrate the plant tissue and get their oxygen that way. And again, the adult stages have they had thorax and abdomen, and there's various characteristics on those which are useful for identification. This is a male mosquito, and you can see that it's got fuzzier antennae than the females. They have also longer palps that are quite fuzzy, and they have what is called claspers at the end of the abdomen for grabbing onto the female and inseminating her. And here's diagrams of the one half of a pair of claspers on different species, again showing the various structures that can be used for taxonomy. And one of the interesting things about mosquito males is that when they emerge from the pupal case, they cannot mate immediately. It takes about 24 hours for the claspers to rotate 180 degrees before they can copulate with the females. And again, as I say, all of these features are useful for identification. So non-Anopheles mosquitoes feed parallel to the skin. The larvae are opposite to the water surface, but here's a female mosquito feeding on my arm. Now, Anopheles mosquitoes feed on an angle, and this one is blood engorged, so you can see the blood being formed inside the abdomen. Here's a sequence of blood feeding. So it starts off, the abdomen is quite small, and as it sucks in blood, it gets distended and it gets a little red. And if they feed long enough, they will often start to metabolize some of the blood and get rid of water, which contains some blood still. The red blood corpuscles make it red. And this is a cartoon by Gary Larson, and this does not happen because mosquitoes do not feed on arteries or veins. They feed on the capillary bed in the skin. Now, this diagram shows various kinds of life cycles of mosquitoes. So on the top left, you can see the dotted pattern shows where eggs are found. The crossed hatch shows where larvae and pupae are found, and the white areas show where there's adults. So if you look at the very top bar, you can see that most of the year is spent in the egg stage. The larval stages are just in April and May and maybe a little bit of June. The adults fly between May and beginning of August, depending on weather circumstances, and there's only one generation a year. The second bar shows that there are up to 3 generations a year. And if we skip down to the 4th and 5th one, you can see that this particular species, the larval stages overwinter, and that's the longest period of their life cycle. The egg stage is very short, and again, they can have multiple generations. And the bottom one bottom two, show that the adults can overwinter. And again, the larval stages and egg stages are quite reduced. And on the very bottom one shows that of three generations in this particular species in certain areas. So their life cycle can be quite varied. Now, this particular species, Aedes albopictus, is a great carrier of several diseases, including dengue fever, eastern equine encephalitis, yellow fever, West Nile, Zika. And the red part shows the theoretical and the distribution of this species for carrying these disease organisms. The black dots show the actual, and some of the black dots are outside the theoretical because they may have moved or they may have gotten it locally and the predictions are wrong. But we're getting to the point where we can predict where mosquitoes live and therefore what diseases might be prevalent in those particular areas. Okay, in Canada, we only get a few cases of malaria each year, and this is usually contacted elsewhere in travels, business travel, or in vacation travel. However, in southeastern Canada back in the 1820s, when they were doing all the canal construction for commerce, transport of goods and services between cities, when there were few roads or railroads, there was malaria, and it was a problem because there were malaria mosquitoes, and there were enough people to be able to transmit the malaria. But today, there are still malaria mosquitoes, but the population doesn't have malaria, and so there are no human hosts to be able to transmit the disease to other humans. But in the world, there's lots of different species that are major vectors of malaria. Malaria is a disease that kills more people than any other cause. It's all over the world, especially in the tropical and subtropical areas. But as they say, even in Canada, which is not really shown what the species we have here, because it's not a big problem. There are malaria carriers that are present, and if with global warming, we may have a problem in the future. Okay, for the province of Alberta, where I live, there's only two concerns. There's Western equine encephalitis, and this is endemic and has been around for millennia. It's in many birds and mammals and also in amphibians and reptiles. And horses and people are dead-end hosts. We're recent immigrants to North America, and we tend to get sick. There is a vaccine for horses. And the second problem for Albertans is West Nile encephalitis. And this virus originally came from Africa and Asia, but is now endemic in North America since 1999. And you may have heard a few years ago of corvid birds. Those are birds in the family Corvidae, such as crows and jays and ravens. They were dying off in droves for a while, but the susceptible individuals have died off, and evolution has made so that they are now fairly resistant to this disease. But both of these diseases could raise up and cause problems because there's no human vaccines for either Western equine encephalitis or West Nile virus encephalitis. So yeah, got to avoid being bitten. That's the big thing. And in the fourth section, I'll talk about that. So this is the end of part 2. In part 3, we're going to look at black flies, no-see-ums, horse flies, snipe flies, musket flies, and some other flies. And in part 4, we're going to talk about avoiding bites and killing black flies. Thank you for your attention.